So let's summarise all that law on certainty of subject matter. Let's make life nice and simple. According to Re Goldcore in the Privy Council from 1995, if your property is tangible, certainly, you have to segregate each trust fund from every other trust fund. All that property must be segregated off, which is why in the facts in front of us, because the Smurf had her coins separated off, she could say she had a valid trust over her property. Whereas for Iron Man and Joker, if they were only meant to have half each of those coins, they didn't know which were theirs and which were the other person's. So that's Re Goldcore with the general rule. The slight exception to that appears to come out of the Court of Appeal case in Hunter and Moss. In Hunter and Moss, the Court of Appeal appeared to hold, Lord Justice Dillon, that if the property was intangible, shares in that case, then each share was indistinguishable from every other share, so it shouldn't matter whether or not you had segregated your trust fund from other trust funds or not. Lord Justice Dillon, it seems, was very keen to stop an inequity happening in that particular case, and the poor employee not getting the money he was entitled to. The rule is put a bit more straightforwardly in Re Harvard Securities. If you read the judgment of Mr. Justice Neuberger, he has to follow the Court of Appeal in Hunter and Moss, and does, and he suggests what Lord Justice Dillon clearly meant was one rule for tangible property and another rule for intangible. If you read Lord Justice Dillon closely, he never actually says that, but it's the obvious inference. If you really want to show off, read Hunter and Moss in the weekly law reports, and read it also in the All England law reports, and you'll see the judgment is reported ever so slightly differently at the key point. And see if you think you can make any difference out of the subtle distinction in wording. I'll do a podcast on that on my site a bit later on. The problem with this approach in Hunter and Moss is there's an earlier Court of Appeal judgment in McJordan and Brookmount which said, in relation to money in bank accounts, you do have to segregate out the money which you want to have held on trust from the remaining money in that account. Now note, McJordan and Goldcore are cases that deal with insolvency, and I think the courts in those cases were very keen to make sure that one class of unsecured creditors weren't advantaged over another. However, Lord Justice Dillon attempts to distinguish McJordan and Brookmount. Read the judgment for yourself and see if you're convinced by the distinction. I'm not convinced, I am personally. A way out of all of this, which I've discussed in my textbook for a little while, and which the Supreme Court of New South Wales advanced in White and Shorthall, is to say, well, instead of needing to have all these things done in separate trusts, why not just have one big trust? Now here's the point. If you decide you're going to have one trust for the Smurf, one trust for Iron Man, and one trust for the Joker, that means you've got to have three completely separate trust funds. Each trust has got to have its own segregated property. And so on these facts, that's difficult for Iron Man and Joker, whereas the Smurf has all of her coins separated off in a box, so she can say, I have segregation, therefore I can have a valid trust. The other two can't, because they don't know which property is Iron Man's and which property is meant to be Joker's, which is meant to go to which trust. But if instead we simply had one big trust fund, with all of this money held on one general trust, that would be fine, because we would know what the trust fund for that trust is, and that's all we're worried about. Can we know that this property here, this fund here, is separate from all the other money in the world? And clearly it is. This is the only money in this vault now. So if Goldhunter had simply said, all of my coins in my vault are to be held on trust for Iron Man, the Smurf, and the Joker equally, so that my trustees can decide which coins go to which of these beneficiaries, that would have been absolutely fine. As long as you make it clear to the trustees what it is they're supposed to do and what their powers are, you have certainty of subject matter here if this is done as one big trust. The problem is doing it as three separate trusts, as Goldhunter tried to do, because he needed to segregate off each little trust, and he simply hadn't done. So it's a tiny distinction, and it's this kind of close, tight, lawyerly distinction. You might say this is just messing about with formalities, this is technicalities. And that's obviously what the court thought in Hunter and Moss. If you read Modern Equity by Professor Jill Martin, she clearly has the view that this is over much technicality. We don't need to worry about this level of certainty in cases like Hunter and Moss. English law clearly is still saying in cases of tangible property we must make these distinctions and segregations. But you might ask, well, 120 pence is exactly the same as any other 20 pence. Why do we need to distinguish between them? They're all worth the same, they all look the same, they're all intrinsically the same. Why bother distinguishing? I must say I think distinguishing is important. I think the segregation is important because otherwise the trustees cannot know which property they're holding on which trust. But a simple way of getting around it is simply to have one big trust, make all the property in that one big trust separate from everything else, and then give the trustees powers as to how they're to deal with the various bits of property. That is absolutely fine. Read White and Shorthall, I suggest. It's a very good analysis and deconstruction of Hunter and Moss. But what actually is English law is difficult. Gold Cause Privy Council, merely persuasive authority. Hunter and Moss is Court of Appeal. It has been followed in Harvard Securities and the High Court. So the most recent Court of Appeal decision would seem to be English law. But for the fact it seems to do something rather unfortunate with McJordan and Brookmount. So we might wonder whether it's right. And now we have this, I think, very good Australian decision in New South Wales, which I think explains, or rehearses, in fact, a lot of the academic argument as to why Hunter and Moss is possibly not a good decision. So I suggest reading all of those, but this is the basic point. It's about segregation. If you have two or more trust funds, you've got to segregate out those separate trust funds. If you just have one big trust, then as long as all of that property is separate from all the other property in the world, that will be absolutely fine. The trustees can just have powers within that trust as to how to use the property. Hope that's helped. Goodbye from all our stars. Iron Man, Silent, Smurfette, Very Happy, Harry Potter Barrister, the Joker, the Incompetent Doctor, and the presumably now dead Goldhunter. And waving from all at Smurfbank, your Smurf money provider.